We're going to get into ISIS now. David Cameron gave a speech before the UN 2 or 3 days ago now where he basically compared anyone who questions the official narrative behind 9/11, behind 7/7, behind ISIS itself. He compared them to ISIS insurgents, ISIS terrorists. He basically tried to make the point that this is a recruiting ground for ISIS terrorists. Anybody who questions the official version of events behind any government terrorism action, behind any so-called staged event. We got that clip set up now, so we're going to go to David Cameron before the UN. Here's the clip.
We must defeat this ideology in all its forms. As evidence emerges about the backgrounds of those convicted of terrorist offences, it is clear that many of them were initially influenced by preachers who claim not to encourage violence, but whose worldview can be used as a justification for it. We know this worldview, the peddling of lies, that 9/11 was somehow a Jewish plot, or that the 7/7 London attacks were staged. The idea that Muslims are persecuted all over the world as a deliberate act of Western policy. The concept of an inevitable clash of civilizations. We must be clear. To defeat the ideology of extremism, we need to deal with all forms of extremism, not just violent extremism. For governments, there are some obvious ways we can do this. We must ban preachers of hate from coming to our countries. We must prescribe organizations that incite terrorism against people at home and abroad. We must work together to take down illegal online material like the recent videos of ISIL murdering hostages. And we must stop the so-called non-violent extremists from inciting hatred and intolerance in our schools, our universities, and yes, even our prisons. Of course, some will argue that this is not compatible with free speech and intellectual inquiry.
Yeah.
But I ask you, would we sit back and allow right-wing extremists, Nazis or Ku Klux Klansmen to recruit on our university campuses? No. So we shouldn't stand by and just allow any form of non-violent extremism.
Okay.
We need to argue that...
So that's David Cameron before the UN a few days ago, comparing anybody who questions 7/7 or 9/11 to ISIS terrorists themselves. And remember, with the James Foley beheading video, the Metropolitan Police came out immediately after that video was released and said that anybody who even watches it on YouTube or on any other video sharing platform could be committing a terrorist act. So even in the commission of actually just watching the video, they threatened people with terrorism. Of course, millions of people did actually watch the video in Britain, so it was an empty threat. But for him to actually make that comparison, and remember, you know, back in 2001, we had George Bush. Here's the article out of Daily Mail. Met Police warn people that viewing extremist material may be a terror offence. Simply watching a video on YouTube could be an act of terrorism, which, as I made the point in the video about the James Foley beheading, which got 900,000 views on YouTube, they don't want people to see this, because if you actually watch the beheading videos, and this is why a lot of questions have circulated, indeed from within the Metropolitan Police itself, they had private investigators come out and say that the James Foley beheading video was, quote, staged. He may have been killed off camera later on, but the beheading video itself was not a graphic portrayal of him being killed. They're afraid of people asking questions about this, and especially with the other American Sotloff being beheaded since, the British hostage being beheaded after that. They don't want people actually digging into this. But the fact that he even came out and said that, and then you can trace it back to 2001, where Bush said, we must not tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories about 9/11. We see this theme running through the so-called demonization of anybody who even dares to ask questions about the narrative that is being pushed to justify US military intervention in the Middle East. Even with the David Haines video, the most recent British hostage, he kind of came out and said, this is the truth about ISIS. He was representing ISIS. He sounded like the, quote, conspiracy theorist that David Cameron was talking about in that video. So they're trying to correlate ISIS propaganda with so-called truther propaganda, or basically anyone who questions the official narrative. And it's downright creepy. David Knight, what do you think after watching that clip of David Cameron?
Well, Paul, as we're doing it, of course, he says many people are going to say that this is going to impinge on free speech. Well, quite obviously it is. He's throwing that out there because he knows that it's going to impinge on free speech. He's talking about things like web censorship. He says we need to defeat the ideology of extremism. Now, that can be anything that he doesn't like, okay? He's saying not just violence, but we need to defeat an ideology. In other words, we need to ban and censor ideologies. Who is he to pick what ideologies are going to be censored? And we've already seen with hate laws that they always use that against anybody that they wish. They can use it against Christians if they want. If they're talking about abortion, they can say that that's a hateful speech or whatever. That is something that can be, that's malleable, that the leaders can use in any way that they want. And I'm reminded of these pronouncements at the very beginning of this. It was the beginning of September. We had the guy who's now running for Senate in Massachusetts. Well, he was in Massachusetts. Now he's running in New Hampshire, Brown. And I did a video on it, the Centerfold senator, because basically he was saying that we've got 300 people, Americans, abroad fighting with ISIS, and we need to be able to revoke their citizenship. And that was picked up and used by Ted Cruz as well to say that we don't need to give people their day in court. We don't need to prove any charges against them. We can just accuse them of being ISIS terrorists, then we can revoke their citizenship. And of course, then presumably that was going to revoke some other protections that they had under the law. It's very troubling to see that. Subsequently, we have now seen that the FBI's backpedaled on that and said, well, at most maybe it's 12 people that are over there. So that's how they're blowing up this threat and using it against people. It's outrageous that he would do this.
And in essence, he's saying, you know, anybody who questions 9/11 is a recruiter of ISIS terrorists. You know, 6 of the 9/11 commissioners questioned the final report on 9/11. So, I mean, are they recruiters for ISIS terrorists? And again, if you actually look at the academic studies into what creates terrorists in the Middle East, the major recruiting tool for terrorists is bombing the Middle East. I mean, since we started, or the US and the UK started launching airstrikes against ISIS in the Middle East, we've had 6,000 new ISIS recruits in the Middle East directly as a result of those bombings. So, you know, what have they killed since the airstrike started about a month ago? Maybe a few dozen ISIS terrorists, and yet 6,000 new acolytes have been recruited to the cause. So the true cause of terrorism is not conspiracy theories, in the words of David Cameron. It's bombing the Middle East, flooding the region with weapons. We'll continue to talk about it on The Alex Jones Show after the break. Stay tuned, Infowars.com.
General, what do you think about the FBI saying that there's a terror alert on Monday about a potential Fort Hood situation?
The police are shoving people, shoving Alex, shoving the crowd.
Here we go, folks. I'm being assaulted.
Whether it's the radio show, the news websites, documentary films, or the nightly news, InfoWars is the tip of the spear.
Is this another false flag stage attack to take our civil liberties and put more homeland security while sticking the hands down on the pants on the streets?
It's up to us to set brush fires in the minds of men and women everywhere. And that's what PrisonPlanet.tv is designed to do.
You watch, the Assad regime is going to be blamed or accused of using chemical weapons against the so-called rebels.
What we see now is a war against reality. It's a war against the truth.
It's more vital than ever that supporters of freedom become members of PrisonPlanet.tv and share their membership with up to 11 friends and family. Visit InfoWarsNews.com today. Become a member, share your membership, and help take the InfoWar to the next level.